I am really excited to be here on behalf of the over 4 million credit union members in the state of Washington. To be honest with you guys, I think that today they would feel very well represented in the conversations that have happened, because there is a note, and I was telling DJ just a bit ago, of civility in this room that we have not heard on the news, right? There has been respect given today, and there has been a lot of information imparted, and I think that that's really valuable. So we were honored and humbled and would love to continue to be a partner of this event, because we know it brings together voices before we get to session and before we have to really dig into some of those hard issues. So as the credit union representative in the room today, I have to say we feel really good on both sides of the aisle, which is why we're really excited to introduce one of the keynotes who I think everyone here could agree is known for their civility and their service. I think they're also probably the only representative we all think of when we open the fridge or make an omelet. It's someone who spent 8 years, I'm leading, but you guys can turn to your brochure, but someone who spent 8 years serving not just the 2nd District, but the state of Washington well. And I think that that is a legacy that will be a blessing to his family, but still won't eclipse 4 generations of investment in this state. So without further ado, I want to welcome up JT Wilcox, the Republican House leader. Please welcome him.
Thank you very much. That was
Thank
very
you, Samantha.
nice.
Appreciate it. Representative, come on up and join the stage.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for being here. I really appreciate that you have been here pretty much all day. I know you had to drop off your wife and run around in the morning, but I think it's just a real testament to your engagement with a wide body of folks who are here, that you've been here with us all day. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, and I will say that this is a great preparation for the Senate, and for the Senate, for the House.
I was going to say, for the Senate, what are you going to tell us?
I can't believe I said that.
Yeah, Freudian slip.
For the session, really. You know, we have a part-time legislature. And it takes a little while to, you know, sort of transition your mind into what's going to happen in the session. And I think a few events like this is really good for everybody. And I saw a bunch of freshman legislators here, and I think they're going to get the most benefit out of it. But even people that have been there for a while need this kind of redirect. And yeah. I just cannot tell you what a good job you're doing here.
Thank you. I appreciate it. How does it feel, first, as leader, heading into your first full term as leader of the House Republicans? What is it like generally, now that you've taken on that mantle, move from among the leadership to at the top of the leadership, particularly as we live in this space between an election that some call a blue wave and a session that who knows where that might go, but in this sort of interim space, how does that feel as leader these days?
Well, first I was elected leader the first time right at the end of session. So this was a re-election. I got to be leader during that election period. And honestly, it doesn't feel that different to me, because I was blessed, like our whole caucus was, to have a predecessor in Dan Christensen who shared about everything that you possibly can in this job. Now, there are some burdens that maybe you can't share, but Dan was a remarkably open leader. And there were no bad secrets that I had to be indoctrinated in. But I think going forward, we are in a somewhat different situation. We've just come off of, I think, 5 years now of very close chambers. You know, with some of that time, the Senate being in Republican hands, and for the last few years, a really close House, too, with Democrats having 50 members and Republicans having 48. And that just forces there to be a fair amount of collaboration. And I think that's good for the state. And we've got a lot of things that indicate that it's going to be different in the coming 2 years. First of all, it's not as close. We had an election that looked disastrous for Republicans during the primary. With about 17 seats being underwater. And in the end, we had some good people that clawed back, and we ended up saving 10 of those and being down 7. But that really means that if the Democrats choose to ignore the minority, they can pass whatever they decide that they want to do. I hope that the habits that have been established over the last few years continue, and you're going to see good participation on both sides. Another thing that is really, really different is the fact that the person that I've said is one of the only 2 political geniuses produced by Washington State, Frank Chop, is announcing that he is going to step down as Speaker at the end of this session. And, I think that there's not very many elected people in that building that have been there when he wasn't the Speaker. And I think for our caucus, it's going to take a little while to adjust to whoever shows up. I think it's hard for people in their caucus to even imagine a different person occupying that office. And there's the potential for, I think, a lot of conflict over this session as they sort out who is going to take his place. And I'm sure that there's a lot of pent-up ambition. I said a little bit earlier, I think in December, when he made that announcement that we're going to miss him. I think Frank is a fair man. He ran the House in almost every case in a very fair way. And he also is a link to the past when you had Republican and Democrat parties that did, I think, a better job than we do now of representing the cross-section of people across Washington. And I hope that he says he's going to continue to serve as a conventional member. And I hope that he's able to model how that looks to everybody else, because he actually may provide a great service in being just a regular member too.
As we discussed, as you know, I labeled, based on the research, that the fall from the 17 seats in the House where Democrats held the lead out of the primary to 7 victories, that 10 race differential, as I believe the steepest fall from the primary to the general, really in the history of our state. Now, we can argue that the Blanket primary only goes back to 2000, 2001, but certainly since 2000, 2001, there's never been a fall by any party from the primary to the general of that magnitude. And particularly in a wave election, which is ostensibly a wave election. How did that happen? What did you all do differently that helped claw back some of those seats, as you said? Because it really was historic, I think, whether we have consensus around that or not. As one person's opinion, that was a big deal.
Well, I appreciated you noticing that. One thing that we've learned about elections over the last few years, and I hope that this is only temporary, but not very many people are changing their minds on issues or candidates. What elections are about mostly is the decision of whether or not you're going to vote, turnout. And turnout is driven by enthusiasm, and people motivate enthusiasm in a variety of ways. Sometimes it's by building up your own candidate. Other times it's by creating outrage regarding the other candidate. And I think generally Washington elections have not been that nationalized. We have done a pretty good job of making them about the individual district, but I'm not really sure that was the case this year. I think that primary really was a nationalized election, and it's plain that the Democrats had a much more motivated base that couldn't wait to get out there and vote, even in the primary. And we are used to being outspent. The House Republicans generally are outspent at least 2-1, but I think this year it was a little closer to 3 or 4-1 in terms of campaign resources. And we knew that if we were going to have a chance, we had to put all of our efforts into getting out the vote. And we had a pretty good data effort this time. We started early because we knew at the end of the voting period that whatever we did would be drowned out by the much greater resources of the other side. And we had actually a pretty good chunk of motivated volunteers that went door to door and got on the phone. And we just did a much better job of having people that were motivated to vote for our candidates than we did in the primary. I don't think there's any miracles that were performed. It was hard work. And I would also say that I thought that we had a pretty darn good group of candidates. The incumbents that were returning are solid. And the freshmen, we have a large freshman class. It's 10 or 11. One of them has been a senior commander in Cyber Command, for example. Another is a Harvard Law graduate and an officer in JAG. We've got Jenny Graham from Spokane, who has a unique perspective and has worked for decades in victims' rights. We have Kelly Chambers, who was a young teenaged single mom, and over the next 2 decades built a multi-million-dollar business with hundreds of employees, along with her husband. So in the end, great candidates make a difference too. And
am I correct that you have the first openly gay member of the Republican caucus in the House?
That's correct.
Yeah. Skylar Rood?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, I think Skylar is probably the most popular person in Olympia. The people that were rooting for Skylar are just without number. Yeah. And I'm really proud of Skylar.
So what do you think this means, this big, significantly, to your point, bigger freshman class? At the same time, the overall caucus is shrinking because of losses. What does that mean for the Republican caucus in the House? How will that change the nature of the caucus, not just leading it, but as people interact with it from the third house or the outside?
Well, I think to some extent that depends on what the agenda of the Democrats is. Their agenda is going to prevail. We know that. And if a bill comes to the floor, history tells us that if it's controversial, Republicans are going to lose. But I think as you become more and more experienced in the legislative world, you begin to understand that although that vote is the thing that people focus on, it's probably the least influential thing that you do, especially when you're in the minority. Your job in the minority is to advance the things that you care about and your voters care about by argument, by tactics, by suggestions. And we've got great members who know how to work on issues inside committees, sort of out in the wings and on the floor. And when you have good debaters, what really happens is the other side doesn't want to bring bad ideas to the floor, because they may be able to prevail in a vote, but they don't want to have to hear how this doesn't work. And in fact, sometimes you'll see them taking bills down. I think that's to Frank's credit, when it's become apparent that this just isn't as good an idea as we thought it was. Being able to present your opinions in the most persuasive way is the best check on the majority that we have when we're in a smaller minority, as we are this time.
What is a J.T. Wilcox Republican?
Well, I'm not leading a movement. I'm just a guy, grew up on the Nisqually River, and I try to reflect my district and do what's right. And I think that most legislators are like that. I am not, this sounds odd being a politician, I am not someone that gives a lot of speeches. I think in the end, people judge you by your actions. And when they wish that I would say this or that, or that I would call people out, I try to tell people, I'm going to take care of this in the right way at the right time, according to what my mind and my conscience tells me, and judge me by that, please. I think I'm like a lot of Republicans and like a lot of people in the state of Washington. We want safe families, safe communities. I grew up in one of the most beautiful places that you can imagine, and I want my children and my grandchildren to be able to be there and be healthy. So we care deeply about the quality of the environment, And like a lot of people that grew up in the rural or the farming world, we're pretty frugal. And we value the resources that we take in the form of taxes from the taxpayers of Washington. And we know that taxes are necessary, but we want to be able to look people in the eye and tell them that we did the best job that we could to use those dollars efficiently for the best things. Mm-hmm. And if that's a J.T. Wilcox Republican, then I guess I'll live with that.
There were two sort of somewhat subtle changes to Republican caucus this year, to leadership and caucus otherwise, that from the outside appear to have had the invisible hand of J.T. Wilcox, and for which I think you deserve credit in your leadership. One was sort of guiding Representative Matt Manueller through a process that led to him to announce that he would resign his position regardless of the outcome. That was like an unseemly thing for a number of folks, and I think your leadership massaged and managed that out well. Likewise, Matt Shea was in leadership. He's no longer in leadership. It appears that the invisible hand of J.T. Wilcox may have had an influence there. Both of those things, I think, reflect well on changing the type of, not just the perception, but literally the constitution of the caucus. Any observations about those changes or things that you'd like to share about why and how those things came about?
Well, caucuses really work by consensus. I often tell people that, my background's in family business. A caucus is exactly like a family business. You can't fire anybody. You, in the end, have to get along. And generally, things don't happen as quickly as you'd like, but consensus emerges in the end. And you work your way through the crises that arise. And I would give my caucus credit for, good results that have happened. And because I'm the leader, I would ask that people reserve their blame for me when it doesn't work out as well.
Yeah. Would you, I really like Paul Harris as well. The new caucus chair, is that his role?
Yeah.
Who took Matt Shea's spot, and both of you strike me as very pragmatic policymakers. Is the Republican caucus increasingly pragmatic?
I think most Republicans feel like they are very realistic, and I hope that our caucus is seen as being pragmatic. I think Paul is a great legislator. He also stands alone on a few things. We used to laugh about he and Tammy Green that were always the no on every liquor bill. And, Paul kind of lives his faith when it comes to expanding availability of liquor. But Paul's a guy that I think believes that it's possible to take less than a perfect result, and he's always willing to engage to make that happen. And that's kind of the way I am too. I've lived my life in business, and my customers or my family's customers have been the biggest grocery chains in the United States. And when you do business with people like that, you understand you don't always get the deal that you want. But often a deal is better than nothing. And there's things that we're not going to bend on. Those are things that are a matter of principle. But I think you're also going to see a lot of Republicans that want to have a better result in the end rather than, being able to brag about how tough they are.
Yeah. Questions from you all in the audience? I don't see a hand go up. Is there one? Oh, great. Very good.
Thank you. I'm George Kahn with the Washington PUD Association. So thank you so much for being here, Representative Wilcox. So my question, many of our public utility districts are located in rural communities throughout the state. Even some of the more urban PUDs have rural components to them as well. So many of the issues that we've dealt with over the years, be it energy, environment, telecommunications, transportation, have really exacerbated the rural-urban divide, and we've pushed back on many of those issues. So my question is whether or not the change in majority will make these issues more difficult to push back or mitigate, and perhaps reframing them as rural economic development generates more of a bipartisan flavor to many of these issues that sometimes polarize the legislature between urban and rural communities?
Well, I appreciate that question, and I think that it's at the background of a whole lot of the breakout sessions that you've had here. And I do think that we need to restate a few of these things. I think Republicans have at least I think I've made a mistake at making everything about rural people and the rural economy. The truth is, we've got more in common than we talk about sometimes. And then the other thing I guess is that because farming and food production has become so efficient, there's just not that many people that work in food production anymore. And it's an economic driver, but it's not in many parts of the state a big employer. The economy that I think we really need to rebuild is the small town and small city economy. And because that has collapsed, it's meant that there's this huge mismatch in terms of where people live and where they work. I'm probably the second most rural legislator in Washington, believe it or not. And I say that because my biggest town is the little town of Yelm, and I think there's somewhere around 10,000 residents now. That's the smallest, largest city in a district of any of the 49 districts except, I think, for the 7th. And Yelm has grown a lot since I was going to high school there, but the employment is actually down. And so all of these, 10,000 people, if they work, almost all of them are having to get on the roads and go to Seattle, Tacoma, or Olympia because that's where the jobs are. But all of these people can't afford to live there, or else they choose not to have that lifestyle. And what I would hope happens as we have this discussion about GMA and about density is we look at it as something of a two-way street. I understand that they want more density in urban areas, but at the same time, let's figure out a way so that we can create more employment in the small towns and small cities, because I want my people that live in the small towns of the 2nd District to have the lifestyle that a lot of us did when I was younger, which meant that you got to work really close to where you lived. And you had so much more of your time with your family and in your community instead of being in the community of I-5.
How do you navigate this sort of seeming divergence between the traditional Northwest Republican, Dan Evans, Joel Pritchard, Slade Gorton, Ralph Monroe, and what we see on cable TV about the modern National Republican Party, which is does not, to me, seem to reflect that ethos of the Northwest strain of Republicanism. How do you sort of navigate that where, the base of the party, maybe the funders maybe get mobilized or motivated based on national stuff, but, there's this sort of regional threat of republicanism that is unique and longstanding?
Well, there are some great books about the history of the electorate in the state of Washington. George Scott has done some analysis on this, and we really do have a fairly unique history. A lot of it is Scandinavian, and then other more recent groups that moved into our state. So it is unique, and we have this shining example. The other genius, I think, that Washington has produced in politics, that's Dan Evans. But in my job, the national political scene is something that you live with, but I honestly don't really watch a lot of national broadcasts. I think it kind of detracts from my ability to do my job here. I don't comment on national politics, and I was just as true to that when Obama was president as I am when Trump is president. And we try really hard when we're recruiting candidates to not just fill the box not just find somebody that sounds like the description of a successful politician. We try to find people that have been embedded in their communities for decades and sometimes even for generations. And so it really is about the people that you represent, not about what people are seeing on Fox or MSNBC. And I think we've had some really successful people who fit that mold. And that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what's good for people that live in the communities that we represent. I can't change what national politics are going to do, but I guess I always go back to, what's kind of bedrock for me, which is in the long run, people are going to judge me, my associates in my caucus, by what we do and how we behave. And if people decide that they're going to judge us just by what they see on TV at the national level, I really can't reach those folks.
What about, did I see his hand go up here? Over here? Great, okay.
Yes, I'm a county assessor, so I have a property tax question. I deal with exemptions for the property tax. And as you know, there's a senior exemption for folks making an income of under $40,000. And there's all sorts of stuff out there about raising that to $100,000. And for rural counties, that could be quite a hardship. Is there anything that you've heard that really is attractive to you that might be for property tax reform?
Well, I've been on the finance committee as long as they've had it there, and I've been there. And that comes up every year. We've had lots of bills that adjust that, but I understand what you're saying. If you raise it up too far, it crushes the smaller and more rural counties because their property values are so much lower. Yet if you don't raise it significantly, it has almost no impact in King County, for example, or maybe for big parts of Pierce County. I'm sure that Ed Orcutt, who's going to be our ranking member there and cares about this deeply, he's going to be working on a way to index this because it is absolutely not a case where one size fits all. It's probably the perfect case for proving that that's really a good idea, although that's what we have right now. And the last thing that we want is a result that means that older people have to move to a place that they're probably not comfortable with simply because the house that they bought 40 years ago has become too expensive for them to remain in anymore. It's a tragedy, and we get probably more letters on that than just about anything in the legislature.
Where do you see the Democratic caucus in the House and the House Republicans more aligned than not? What are the things that the two caucuses have in common that might get overlooked from an outsider's perspective?
Well, I think it's becoming increasingly plain that so many of the issues surrounding housing affordability, homelessness, we used to think that those were problems that Seattle had. But there is not a rural community in Washington that doesn't have exactly the same problems. So I think we are becoming a lot more unified when it comes to what are the problems that we have to work on. Now, we may not have perfect agreement. In fact, we may not have any agreement at all right now about what the solutions are, although we also have one of the unique talents in the legislature, in the House Republicans, in Andrew Barkis, who has managed thousands of single-family homes for 30 years. And one of Andrew's, bedrock convictions is my job as a manager or a landlord is not to evict people. He says, my job is to keep people in homes. And so I know that he is working hard in cooperation with a number of people to figure out how can we provide some reforms that are fair to the property owners, but at the same time, make it far less likely that people are going to be evicted from their homes. Yeah. I think that's something that we're going to find that we have in common. And if we are able to reach an understanding among the various stakeholders in this, that the perfect solution for Seattle doesn't necessarily have to be imposed on Lacey or OMAC, but we have flexibility for some other solutions, we may make a lot of progress in that arena. Another thing that afflicts, everybody, there's hardly a person in Washington that isn't touched. It's becoming commonplace to say this now, by opioids or some other drug addiction. It's certainly not a respecter of any of the divisions in our society. It touches everybody. And again, we're going to have some maybe divisive solutions, but at the same time, I think the governor's putting a lot of effort into this. There's not a caucus in Olympia that doesn't think that this is a critical issue and wants to find solutions, as long as the solutions are going to work across the state and are not just customized for one place.
Yeah. Obviously, in the minority, you have to play a lot of defense. You've already sort of spoken to that a little bit. Where do you expect you might be able to have opportunity to play a little bit of offense in the 2019 legislative session?
Well, I think that's a great question. And one place where I guess I've got two things. Where it's offense because we're all working together. I think that Frank Chopp in particular wants to work on rural economic development. And I'm looking forward to good things happening there. But I also think that Republicans, I mentioned it a little bit before, we really believe in being as efficient with our dollars as we possibly can. I think there's hardly a Republican alive that doesn't think the fact that the revenue for the state has been increasing from 9 to 15% per biennium means that that is enough revenue to do the basic job that we have to do for the citizens of Washington. So we're going to be playing a lot of offense when it comes to the vast number of new tax resources that the governor's asking for right now, and I suspect that the House and Senate Democrats will ask for.
There may not be any upside in answering this question, but I'll ask it anyway. If you were a betting man, as a frugal Norwegian, I imagine you're not, but if you were, who would you bet is the next Democratic leader in the House?
Oh my. This is such a great opportunity to sow discord. No, I don't think I'm gonna answer that. They've got some great choices, and they've got some not so great choices, perhaps. But caucuses, as I mentioned, they're a lot like family businesses. They're going to find a way to get consensus. And I would. This is a funny way to say this. I would not be surprised if we were all very surprised by who ends up emerging in that process. And I will say this: I have sympathy for that person. It is very difficult to follow a legend. And we see that in our work lives and all over society. Being selected to follow a genius is not an easy spot to be in. So my sympathies to whoever that is, and I'm looking forward to the political joust with them when it happens.
There's no upside to answering this question, but I'll ask it anyway. If you were to place a bet, and as a frugal Norwegian, I expect you wouldn't, but who will be the next Republican candidate for governor in 2020?
Well, I think there's a few people that are perhaps interested and would do a great job. I have a lot of respect for Susan Hutchison. I think Bill Bryant is, I know almost no one as sincere, as knowledgeable as Bill, and I'm expecting that he'll be very interested. And I'm sure that we've got a Senate Republican caucus full of people that would like to be governor too. They'll hate me for saying that.
Any chance that Pierce County Executive Dan Meyer runs?
Oh gosh, I'm so glad you mentioned. I don't know if he will, but you could have no better choice, Republican or Democrat, than Bruce Dameyer. And since you left me some room to expand on this a little bit, I'll just say, to me, one of the most harmful things that are happening in the state of Washington politically is the fact that we're becoming a place where there's no expectation of a turnover in political authority. That's not good for anybody. I don't know if anyone's to blame. Maybe I'm to blame because I haven't led my caucus to a victory yet. But I feel so strongly that It is corrosive to democracy if we become a single-party state. What that does is it corrupts the party that's in power, because they have no real expectation of accountability. And it means that the party that's not in power has the potential of becoming less and less responsible. And I hope that Bruce or someone equally impressive runs and wins, because we need accountability in the state of Washington, especially, I think, in the executive branch, where we've got 2 generations of management that never really has the expectation that the public is going to see what they do. And I think one thing that I really want to do in the minority this year, I wish I would have mentioned it earlier, we don't have government accountability right now. The same party never really is very incented to examine the actions of the executive branch. And I would like us to use our bully pulpit, that's about all that a minority has, to do everything that we can to increase accountability for agencies. And that probably means better transparency as well.
What counsel or advice would you give to the folks watching on TVW or who are here in the room about how they can engage with you, how they can inform the work of your caucus, and how they can continue to contribute in the legislative process?
Well, absolutely. The best thing that you can do is come down to Olympia. Letters are good, phone calls are good, but seeing someone in your office is very powerful. And one thing that I really like to do, in fact, it's one of the best fringe benefits of being a state representative, I like to tour people's places of business, their child care, you name it. If they call me up and ask me to come and visit, I almost always get there. And it creates a connection that is really hard to ignore. I guess one of the things that makes me feel bad about my job is I'm amazed at how many people come into the Capitol. I'm glad that they do that, but they come in my office and I can tell that they're scared or apprehensive. And I just feel like my job is to let them know, folks, we work for you. This is my office. It's your office. And I don't care who you are in the state of Washington, you have a right to come in and talk to your representatives, and it's my responsibility to put you at ease so that you can share whatever it is that is bothering you, or whatever it is that you want me to do. And I just wish more people came down there and did the quiet kind of citizen lobbying that is getting across a table with someone and spending 15 minutes or 20 minutes just communicating with sincerity. And I think they would also be amazed at how average all of the elected people in Olympia are, and how sincerely they want to do a good job.
Well, I would be willing to bet you, sir, or anybody in this room $1 that your speaker in January 2023, I know that seems like a long ways away, but I can see the dominoes falling in place.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, and I'm not going to bet against it.
Well, thank you very much, Representative Wilcox, for your support of the Washington State Wire, for being available when I email you late at night sometimes, for participating here all day. I appreciate the civility that you bring to your office and wish you the best of luck in this session and the future. Let's give him a round of applause.